I had been looking forward to moving into my new apartment for months. The day finally arrived, and I was filled with excitement. College was intense, and I felt like I needed a fresh start in a new place. The apartment itself was charming, with vintage wallpaper and a cozy feel that instantly made me feel at home. My new roommate, Emily, greeted me with a bright smile as I walked in. She seemed perfect, friendly, organized, and eager to help me settle in. We quickly bonded over shared interests, late-night snacks, and our mutual love for movies. I felt lucky to have her as a roommate. At first, everything was great. We'd stay up talking, sharing our dreams and fears. I felt like I had found a real friend. But as the weeks passed, a nagging sense of unease crept in. Emily had odd habits. She often kept strange hours, disappearing late at night. When I asked her about it, she would smile and say she was working on some project or hanging out with friends. One night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to her moving around the apartment, her footsteps echoing softly in the hall. Curiosity piqued. I decided to investigate. I followed the sounds to a small hidden door at the end of the hallway. I had never noticed it before. With my heart racing, I opened the door just a crack. What I found inside sent chills down my spine. The room was small, cluttered, and dark. It was filled with photographs, trinkets, and belongings of previous roommates. The walls were lined with eerie pictures of people I didn't recognize. But what struck me the most was the unsettling realization that some of them had vanished without a trace. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. What was going on? I quickly closed the door, my mind racing. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. The next morning, I knew I had to confront Emily. "What's behind that door?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, that? Just some old things," she replied casually, waving her hand dismissively. Nothing to worry about. But I was worried. I felt an instinctual pull to uncover the truth. That night, I decided to do some digging. I searched online for news articles and information about the apartment building. What I discovered made my blood run cold. There had been several disappearances in the building over the years, each more mysterious than the last. Each time, the last person to see them was their roommate. My heart raced as I recalled Emily's behavior. She had never mentioned any of this. Was she hiding something? As the days went by, my anxiety grew. I started to notice more oddities. Emily had an extensive collection of memorabilia from past tenants, old photos, trinkets, and letters that she kept on display. One night, as I sat on the couch scrolling through social media, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced up and caught Emily staring at me, a strange smile on her face. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "Of course, just thinking about how perfect we are as roommates," she replied, her eyes glinting in the dim light. I laughed nervously, but inside I felt a chill. Something was off. Determined to find out more, I decided to talk to some of our neighbors. I knocked on a few doors and introduced myself. Most people were friendly, but when I mentioned the previous tenants, their expressions changed. "It's best not to think about that," one neighbor said, glancing over her shoulder as if someone might be listening. I returned to the apartment, my heart racing. What was happening? The more I learned, the more paranoid I became. I started to question everything about Emily. Was she as friendly as she appeared? What did she really do at night? One evening, while I was preparing dinner, I heard her talking to someone in her room. I pressed my ear against the door, trying to listen. "You don't understand," she said, her voice tense. "It has to be perfect. They can't know." Fear washed over me. I felt my heart race. Was she talking to someone else? What was she hiding? That night, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed a small bag, determined to leave and stay with a friend. I tiptoed toward the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as I reached for the doorknob, I heard Emily's footsteps approaching. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice casual but with a hidden edge. "Just to grab some food," I lied, trying to sound calm. "I'll be right back." Emily looked at me for a moment, her eyes narrowing. "You should stay, we need to talk." I felt trapped. "I really need to go," I insisted, my voice shaking. She stepped closer, blocking my path. "You don't need to leave, Sarah. We can be happy together. I just want us to be friends." Something snapped inside me. "You're not my friend," I shouted, fear and anger flooding my voice. "You're hiding something and I want nothing to do with it." Her smile twisted into something darker. "Oh, Sarah, you wound me. I thought we were in this together." I pushed past her and dashed for the door, but she grabbed my wrist, her grip unyielding. Panic surged through me. "Let go," I screamed. "Why don't we talk about it?" she suggested, her voice eerily calm. "I can show you how perfect we can be." Just then, I remembered the hidden room. If I could get there, I might find proof of her lies. I broke free from her grip and bolted toward the door. I could hear her footsteps behind me, but I didn't stop. I flung open the hidden door and ran inside, slamming it shut behind me. The room was dark and cluttered, but I switched on my flashlight, illuminating the horrifying collection of photos. I rifled through the belongings, searching for something, anything that would help me prove what was happening. My heart raced as I realized I had to get out of there. Suddenly, I heard the door rattle. "Sarah, let me in," Emily called, her voice sweet but twisted. "I just want to talk. We can be friends again." I held my breath, clutching a broken picture frame. "Go away, Emily. You're not my friend. You're a monster." "Monster? Oh, Sarah," she replied, her tone mocking. "You think you can escape me?" Just then, I heard sirens in the distance, and a glimmer of hope sparked in my chest. "Help is coming," I yelled, trying to buy time. "You think they can save you? You're mine now," she said, her voice turning cold. I could hear the sirens getting closer. I had to hold on until help arrived. The tension in the air was thick as I waited, each second stretching into eternity. Then I heard the front door kick open. "Police, put your hands where I can see them," a voice called out. Emily froze, her expression shifting from rage to disbelief. "You brought them here?" she spat, incredulous. "Get back, Emily," I shouted as I stepped back, feeling a rush of adrenaline. Officers rushed in, flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Hands up, now!" they commanded, approaching Emily. I watched as Emily's expression morphed into a mask of fury. "You think you can take her away from me? She's mine." "Step away from her," an officer yelled, grabbing Emily's arm. In that moment, I knew I was safe. Relief flooded over me as the officers restrained her, the tension finally lifting. I felt the weight of fear begin to lift from my shoulders. "Sarah, you'll regret this," Emily screamed as they led her away. "You'll never escape from me." The officers checked on me, and I felt gratitude wash over me. I was free from her twisted obsession. The nightmare was over, but the scars would remain. Days later, I reflected on everything that had happened. I had learned a painful lesson about trust and the darkness that can hide behind a friendly face. I knew I would never forget the terror of living in fear, but I also realized that I was stronger than I thought. As I moved forward, I promised myself I would never let anyone control me again. I would keep my guard up, always remembering that not everyone who smiles is a friend. And somewhere deep down, I knew that Emily would always be watching. Before the next story starts, you might want to subscribe, unless you enjoy feeling watched when you're alone. And like this video, or you might start hearing those footsteps behind you. It was one of those oppressively hot summer days, the kind where the heat seemed to rise from the asphalt in waves, making the whole world feel like a hazy mirage. I had always been an avid runner, and despite the relentless heat, I wasn't about to skip my daily run. Running had always been my escape, a way to clear my mind and leave behind the stress of school, friends, and the creeping anxieties that come with being 16. That day, though, something in the back of my mind told me to stay home. I should have listened. Instead, I decided to head out to the secluded park by the river. It wasn't the most popular spot, but it was quiet, shaded by tall trees that lined the path, and the river provided a cool, constant breeze. It felt like the perfect place to escape the oppressive heat, and I figured the solitude would be an added bonus. Little did I know, that park would soon become the setting of my worst nightmare. When I arrived, the park wasn't entirely empty. A couple of families were gathered around the small playground, watching their kids play on the swings and jungle gym. The sound of their laughter echoed through the park, blending with the soft rush of the river nearby. It was peaceful, almost idyllic. I took a moment to stretch, mentally preparing for the few miles I planned to run. That's when I noticed him. An old man was sitting on a bench near the playground, but something about him immediately made me uneasy. He wasn't interacting with anyone. He just sat there, still as a statue, his eyes locked on the children playing. There was something too intense about the way he was watching them. Like he wasn't just observing, but calculating. His clothes were worn, his face weathered and creased with age. And there was this strange, unsettling stillness about him. I told myself he must be a grandfather, maybe waiting for his family to finish playing. But as I bent down to tie my shoes, I couldn't shake the feeling that his presence was off. I felt his gaze, like a heavy weight, even though I hadn't made eye contact with him. Shaking it off, I plugged in my headphones, cranked up my music, and started my run. As I settled into my pace, the feeling of unease began to fade. The first lap was smooth and easy, the rhythmic sound of my feet hitting the pavement syncing with the music in my ears. The families were still at the playground, and I saw a couple of kids waving as I passed by. I waved back, smiling to myself. It felt good to be out in the fresh air, the shade from the trees making the heat bearable. But as I started my second lap, the park began to empty. The families had packed up, herding their children towards their cars, and soon, I found myself running through an increasingly quiet, empty park. The laughter of the kids was gone, replaced by the eerie silence that hung in the air. The only sound was the soft hum of the river and the crunch of gravel under my feet. That's when I saw him again. The old man wasn't sitting on the bench anymore. He was standing now, further down the path, just standing there, watching me. His eyes were locked on me, the same intense, unsettling gaze he had used on the children earlier. My heart rate picked up, not from the exertion of running, but from the creeping sense of fear that started to coil in the pit of my stomach. He was moving now, walking slowly along the path in the same direction I was running. My rational brain tried to calm me down, telling me he was just an old man walking in the park. Maybe he was going home, or just taking a stroll like I was. But something about the way he moved, the deliberate slowness of his steps, made my skin crawl. It felt like he was following me, but not in the way people naturally follow each other on a shared path. There was an intent behind his movements that I couldn't ignore. I turned up my music, trying to drown out my rising fear, and picked up my pace. The second lap passed without incident, though every time I glanced over my shoulder I could still see him, his figure becoming smaller as I put more distance between us. I told myself I was being paranoid. He was just an old man after all, and I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But then, as I started my third lap, I noticed he was no longer behind me. Relief washed over me for a moment, thinking he had left the park, but that feeling didn't last long. As I rounded a bend in the path, I saw him again. This time, much closer than before. He was walking toward me, slowly, methodically, his gaze still locked onto me. But now there was something different in his eyes, something darker, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. His hand was in his pocket, and he was sucking on a lollipop, the bright red candy glistening in the sunlight. It was such an innocent gesture, yet in the context of the situation, it felt deeply sinister. My heart began to race. I considered turning around and cutting my run short, but that would mean passing him again. The thought of getting close to him, of him possibly reaching out and grabbing me, sent a wave of panic through my body. I kept running, my feet moving faster now, trying to create as much distance between us as possible. But the faster I ran, the more I felt like he was closing in. I could hear my breath coming in shallow gasps, the pounding of my feet against the gravel loud in my ears. The world around me seemed to blur, my vision narrowing as my fear took hold. That's when it happened. As I approached the stretch of the path where he stood, he lunged. His hand shot out, grabbing the wire of my headphones and yanking them out of my ears with such force that I stumbled, nearly falling to the ground. I gasped, my heart pounding in my chest as I whirled around to face him. There he was, standing just a few feet away, his hand still holding the broken wire of my headphones. His eyes were locked onto mine, a sick grin spreading across his face. "Like to play alone, huh?" he said, his voice low and raspy. His words sent a chill down my spine, the malice in his tone unmistakable. Before I could react, he reached out again, grabbing a strand of my hair and twisting it around his fingers. I snapped. Without thinking, I slapped his hand away and sprinted down the path, my legs moving as fast as they could. My mind was a blur of fear and adrenaline, my only thought being to get away from him, to get to safety. I could hear his footsteps behind me, slow and steady, not running but walking with the same deliberate pace as before. It was like he knew I couldn't escape, like he was toying with me. The parking lot wasn't far now, but it felt like miles. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept running, pushing myself harder than I ever had before. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps growing louder, closer. The panic was overwhelming, choking me, making it hard to breathe. When I finally reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't get the key into the lock. My heart was pounding in my chest, my vision blurred with tears of terror. I could hear him approaching, his footsteps slow and steady, the sound of the lollipop clicking against his teeth echoing in my ears. Somehow, I managed to unlock the door and throw myself inside. I slammed the door shut, locking it just as I saw him step into view. He stood there, grinning at me through the window, the lollipop still in his mouth, his eyes gleaming with a sick satisfaction. I started the car and slammed my foot on the gas, peeling out of the parking lot so fast that the tires squealed. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, watching me leave, his figure growing smaller as I sped away. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't done with me, that he would find me again. For weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about that day. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his grin, the way he had reached out and grabbed me. I avoided that park, never went back, and I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that followed me everywhere I went. Even now, years later, every time I see an old man with a lollipop, my heart skips a beat. The memory of that encounter still haunts me. The fear still lingers. I never found out who he was, and that's what scares me the most. He's still out there somewhere. Hit that subscribe button if you dare. Like if you're ready for the next story that will send shivers down your spine and haunt your nightmares. I grew up in a small rural town in central Idaho, where winters were long, cold, and unforgiving. My family relied on wood to keep our house warm, and it was a tradition, almost a ritual, to gather firewood every fall. My dad was the kind of man who never backed down from hard work. He made sure we were out there with him, collecting enough wood to last us through the bitter months. It was always the same routine: get the kids after school, load up the truck, and head into the forest. The mountains were our second home, but there were certain parts we rarely ventured into. This particular day, though, was different. It was a Friday afternoon, and the autumn sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over everything. Instead of heading to our usual spot, my dad decided to try a different logging road. He said it was because we needed a change of scenery, but looking back, I wonder if it was because we'd already stripped the other areas clean of wood. Whatever the reason, he chose a road that was unfamiliar to us, one that led deeper into the mountains, into places I now know we should have stayed away from. The logging road was barely passable, overgrown with weeds and littered with fallen branches. My dad, as usual, had no concerns. He pulled over and told us to get out and clear the path. My brothers and I, tired and annoyed, dragged ourselves out of the truck and started moving debris while my dad supervised. The deeper we went, the more the road seemed to close in around us, the trees growing denser, their branches forming a thick canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt different, heavier somehow, like the mountain was watching us. It wasn't just the quiet that unnerved me. It was the way the quiet seemed to press in on all sides, like the trees were listening. My younger brother Ethan must have felt it too, because he stopped in the middle of the road and asked, "Does anyone else feel like we're not supposed to be here?" I looked at my dad, expecting him to dismiss it, but he didn't say anything. He just kept moving forward, his face set in that familiar expression of determination. But even he seemed less sure, his usual air of confidence shaken by something unseen. We kept moving up the mountain, higher and deeper into the forest, and that feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that if I looked back at just the right moment, I'd see someone or something peering out from the shadows between the trees. The sky had started to darken, the sun dipping behind the peaks, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. The deeper we went, the more isolated we became. Night was falling faster than any of us had anticipated. That's when the dread really began to set in. As we reached a clearing, my dad abruptly called it a day. I remember feeling a rush of relief. It wasn't like him to stop early. He was always the kind of man who wouldn't leave until the truck was overflowing with wood. But today was different. He seemed on edge, glancing nervously at the tree line as if he expected something to step out at any moment. We loaded what little wood we had collected into the truck and began the descent back down the mountain. The truck rattled as we bumped along the uneven road, the headlights cutting through the growing darkness. My brothers were quiet in the back seat, and even my dad was unusually silent, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The feeling of being watched hadn't left me. If anything, it had grown stronger, more oppressive. I kept telling myself we were just being paranoid, that it was nothing more than the isolation and the approaching night playing tricks on our minds. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. We had barely made it halfway down the mountain when something darted out in front of the truck. My dad slammed on the brakes, and I lurched forward, catching myself just in time. A deer had run into the road, and we hit it. The impact was quick, but the sound of it, a sickening thud, sent my heart racing. My dad cursed under his breath and threw the truck into park. He stepped out to check on the animal, and despite every instinct in my body telling me to stay put, I got out too. The deer was already dead, lying motionless on the road. But something was wrong. It wasn't just dead. It was decayed, its body bloated and stiff, like it had been lying out in the sun for days. Its eyes were milky and sunken, and its fur was matted with what looked like dried blood. As I stared down at the carcass, my skin crawled. This didn't make sense. We had just hit it. How could it be in this condition already? My dad knelt beside the deer, examining it closely, his brow furrowed in confusion. He muttered something under his breath, something I couldn't quite make out, but before I could ask him what he'd said, I saw them. Maggots. They were writhing inside the deer's open wounds, hundreds of them crawling through the flesh as if they had been feasting for days. My stomach turned, and I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't possible. A deer didn't decompose like this in a matter of minutes. I opened my mouth to say something, to ask my dad what the hell was going on, but then I heard it. A sound that froze me in place. A shriek. It echoed from the forest, a high-pitched, bone-chilling scream that didn't sound like it came from any animal I knew. It was something else. Something wrong. The sound cut through the silence like a blade, and for a moment, I couldn't move. My dad was already on his feet, eyes wide, scanning the tree line. "Get in the truck," he said, his voice low but filled with an urgency that scared me more than anything else. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled back to the truck, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely buckle my seatbelt. The sound came again, this time closer. Branches snapped in the distance, followed by heavy, deliberate footsteps. Whatever it was big, and it was coming toward us. I didn't need to be told twice. My dad floored the gas, and the truck shot forward, barreling down the mountain at a reckless speed. The headlights bounced and jerked as we hit every rock and pothole in the road. But my dad didn't slow down. The footsteps behind us grew fainter, but I could still hear them. A steady, relentless pursuit just out of sight. We didn't stop until we were out of the forest, the trees giving way to the open valley. Only then did my dad ease up on the gas, but even then, none of us spoke. The tension in the truck was suffocating. A shared understanding that whatever had happened back there was beyond explanation. We drove home in silence, the weight of what we'd experienced settling over us like a dark cloud. My dad didn't say a word, but I could tell by the way he gripped the steering wheel that he was just as shaken as I was. It wasn't until we were safely back home, the warmth of the fire flickering in the hearth, that he finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, as if he didn't want the mountain to hear him. "I saw something," he said, his eyes fixed on the flames. "When we were cutting wood, I saw figures moving between the trees." I stared at him, my blood running cold. He hadn't said anything at the time, hadn't even hinted that he'd seen something. But now, hearing him say it, I knew he was telling the truth. "What kind of figures?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know, but they weren't human." A chill ran down my spine, and I glanced out the window, half expecting to see something staring back at me from the darkness. My dad stood up, his movements stiff, and headed for the stairs. "We're never going back there," he said, his voice firm. "That's not our mountain." And we didn't. We never returned to that logging road. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that whatever was out there in those mountains stayed there. But the truth is, it followed us. Not physically maybe, but in our minds, in our dreams. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced I could hear those footsteps outside my window. My dad became more withdrawn, quieter than he had ever been. Even now, years later, I catch him staring out into the woods, his face drawn and tense, as if he's still expecting something to step out from between the trees. The seasons changed, and winter crept in with its icy grip. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling all sound, but the weight of that day lingered in the air. We tried to move on, to pretend as if nothing had happened. But every time my dad took us out for firewood, there was an unspoken tension. He would look at the mountains, his eyes searching the shadows, as if he feared those figures might appear again. Then, one cold night, something unexpected happened. We were sitting around the fire, the warmth wrapping around us like a comforting blanket. My mom was in the kitchen preparing dinner, and my brothers were engrossed in a board game. I was reading, but I couldn't focus. The memories of that day kept creeping back into my mind, clawing at the edges of my thoughts. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from outside, followed by a series of rustling sounds. My heart raced. I glanced at my dad, who had instantly gone tense, his expression shifting from relaxed to alert. "What was that?" I whispered. "I don't know," he replied, his voice low. He stood up and moved toward the window, peering into the dark. My brothers stopped their game and watched, their eyes wide with fear. "Dad, don't go outside," Ethan pleaded. But my dad, driven by a mix of curiosity and fear, opened the door and stepped into the cold night. In that moment, I understood. The figures weren't just in the woods. They had followed him home. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a deep growl echoed through the house, vibrating the walls. The ground seemed to shake beneath our feet, and I knew whatever had been out there was now inside. "We have to get out," my mom shouted, her voice rising in urgency. My dad shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "No, they'll get you. You can't go out there." The growl grew louder, filling the house with a darkness I couldn't explain. We backed away, cornered against the kitchen counter, fear paralyzing us. Then the shadows began to shift, swirling in the corners of the room. I could feel their eyes on us, their presence looming closer like a suffocating fog. "Please," I cried, desperation spilling from my lips. "Please, someone help us." The shadows pulsed, and in a chilling moment of clarity I saw them. Figures, not human, but not entirely animal either. They moved with a grace that was unnatural, their forms flickering in and out of focus. My breath hitched as I realized they were drawing closer, inching toward us with malicious intent. My dad yelled again, throwing himself in front of us, his body shaking. "Stay back, you won't take them." But the figures didn't care. They surged forward, and I could hear their whispers, a cacophony of voices merging into one haunting chorus. "Let us in! Let us in!" The walls began to close in, the air thickening with dread. I could see my brothers trembling, and my mom was staring wide-eyed, searching for an escape. "Quick," she said, her voice sharp with panic. "We have to find a way out." In that moment of chaos, my dad lunged for the back door, desperate to shield us. "This way!" He pushed us toward it, but as we reached the door, I felt a pull, an unseen force holding me back. "Go!" he shouted, panic clear in his voice. "Get out!" My mom grabbed my hand, but I couldn't move. I could see the figures creeping closer, their twisted faces now visible in the light. My heart raced, a frantic beat against my ribcage. "Dad, please!" But it was too late. The darkness closed in around him, swallowing him whole. "Run!" he screamed, and the door burst open. "Now!" my mom yelled, pulling me through the threshold into the night. We stumbled out into the cold, the wind biting at our skin. We could hear the growls behind us, feel the shadows reaching out, but we didn't stop. We ran, our feet pounding against the frozen ground. The figures pursued us, a relentless tide of darkness. We raced through the trees, branches clawing at our faces, our hearts pounding with terror. The world was a blur, a mix of shadows and panic, and all I could think was to keep running. Finally, we burst into the open, the moonlight flooding over us. We kept moving, adrenaline pushing us forward until we reached the edge of the forest, breathless and terrified. But as we turned back to look, the forest was still, almost peaceful, as if nothing had happened. The shadows had receded, leaving nothing but darkness in their wake. "Is it gone?" Ethan panted, his face pale. "I don't know," my mom replied, her voice trembling. But even as we stood there, the air heavy with dread, I felt it, a whispering chill, a lingering sensation that we were still being watched. The figures hadn't disappeared. They had simply retreated, biding their time. As we stood on the threshold of safety, the realization hit me hard. The mountain wasn't just a place, it was a living entity, holding secrets and terrors that should never have been disturbed. We had ventured too far, and in doing so, we had awakened something dark, something that might never let us go. And even now, years later, I can't shake that feeling. The shadows linger, waiting for the moment we let our guard down. I often wonder if the figures still watch us, lurking just beyond the trees, whispering their dark promises of what lies beneath the surface of our world. As I sit here, years after that night, I still hear the echoes of that scream. I still see the twisted shadows in my nightmares. We may have escaped that night, but deep down, I know the truth. There are some woods best left untraveled, and some shadows that never fade.